All right. Hey, folks. So, welcome to the channel. I'm Faz. This is Faz Lifts. And today I want to start on a big series on fasting, where I talk you through all my experiences with fasting going back almost 20 years now, and a little bit on the pros and cons of the different approaches. And also the benefits in general of fasting and some of the downsides too. So before we get into that, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments about today's video, then pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there is a link in the description. Get in touch, talk, and let's see what I can do for you. All right, so if we go straight into my own personal history with fasting. So my fasting history began in the 2000s. Now, the very first time I heard of fasting, it wasn't through a sort of a company or like a Lean Gains or anything. It was actually a friend of mine on the old forums, the bodybuilding forums. And before anyone really did all this, he fasted 1 day a week. He was this older guy on the forum. He was about 50 at the time, a guy called Paul Blackstone or Phil Blackstone, really jacked guy. And I was in my early 20s at the time. This guy was in his 50s. He was huge and he was lean. And he said, yeah, Faz, I fast 1 day a week. Sunday, I just don't eat anything. It's like, okay, cool. But I didn't think much of it. I just thought, okay, that's pretty unusual. Because bear in mind, this was a time when no one really talked about fasting in bodybuilding circles. It was deemed to be heresy, right? And here was this guy who was jacked, and he fasted a full day for the week, one time per week. Cool. I just put it down to just, old man things, right? But I guess if you're 20 and you're watching this video, you're probably thinking the same things. But anyway, the next guy who really popularized it, and when I started to try it, was about 2005, which was when Martin Birkin came out with his intermittent fasting protocol, which is, I guess, most people's introduction into fasting, which was a 16-8 protocol. He's done some great work on that. And I remember Martin from the forums, because when he was a lot younger, he was a model. He always struggled to keep his weight down because he wanted to keep his weight lower because of his modeling. And yeah, I mean, I remember his posts on the forum trying to get help for his body composition. But anyway, eventually he went and did the Lean Gains thing, and he looks great now. And then my next major big influence was Brad Pilon. Brad Pilon popularized something called Eat, Stop, Eat. And I'll go into it later, but that was the idea of doing 1 or 2, maximum 2, 24-hour fasts a week. And the idea was the rest of the time you just made good choices. But what you could do is just create a huge deficit just by fasting 1 or 2 24-hour periods a week. And I generally come back to that as probably one of my most favorite ways of fasting. So anyway, let's now start looking at the pros first and then maybe the cons. Now, there's a phrase in fasting circles which says, abstinence is easier than moderation. Now, I think that rings true for a lot of people. I would say certainly in the early stages. And I think for some people, they have pretty much a sort of an all or nothing personality. So if they're eating, they're eating. And that has kind of led them to a position where they're probably looking at fasting thinking, I need to drop a few pounds because of that attitude, that sort of all or nothing attitude. Like when I'm bulking, I'm bulking. When I'm not paying attention to my what I'm eating, then I'm just going all out. Before they know it, they wake up 30 pounds too heavy. And it's part of that personality trait of just going right through into something. So it's the thing about fasting is it's sort of like the complete opposite of just like fat bulking, right? But in a sense, psychologically speaking, it's kind of similar because you're just going all in. So like there's no stricter diet than just not eating. Like, no style of dieting is going to be stricter than just saying you're having zero food. So psychologically for some people, that benefits them because they're not moderating. Like I know for me, I mean, years ago, I'm better at it now, but years ago, I was a lot worse at moderation when I first started to drop weight and I was just coming off from being, heavier. I didn't really like the concept of eating less. I was quite happy to just give up food for a few hours and then eat normally. And it sort of balances itself out. So it suits an all or nothing personality, particularly, I would say, an all or nothing relationship with food. A lot of people really don't like just eating a little bit less. They far, far prefer just abstaining from food altogether so that when they do eat, they can eat like they're used to eating, which is what caused them to be overweight in the first place, and look for these methods. So it does suit an all or nothing relationship with food. Now, that's not the same as encouraging binge eating because we have to be careful with our definitions, and that's a very specific form of eating disorder. It's different to what we're talking about here. But yes, it does suit that sort of all or nothing type of personality. So if you find you're that type of person, then it helps. There's also some research to suggest it might help with people who are emotional eaters. So if you just eat out of emotion, or if you eat out of habit and you're not actually hungry, fasting can have some particular benefits for that. Because again, it appeals to psychologically appeals to that mindset. Now, the next thing is, over time, it does seem to increase your ability to control your hunger, and it also reduces your appetite. Now, there are lots of theories as to why this occurs. There's no real consensus yet. So I'll say that. There's no consensus yet. I'm sure you guys in the comments will have some ideas for why you think it works, but to reduce appetite. But in any case, we don't have a concrete resolution. My guess is that it more than likely reduces the levels of circulating insulin in your body, which mean you're probably going to have less ups and downs, and the crashes we know are correlated with hunger spikes. That's kind of my guess. I would also say there's possibly a stomach shrinking effect, which would maybe make it easier to be full. I remember years ago when I was doing a lot of alternate day fasting, which I'll cover in the next episode, my appetite was really low. I had great appetite control, but also my actual appetite when I ate was very, very low too. So there's definitely gives you increased hunger control, and that generally occurs after a while. I know for me, if I'm doing let's say a alternate day fasting protocol, or an everyday fasting, it'll take me a good week to a week and a half of consistently fasting to get over the initial hump, and then I'll be like, okay, I'm feeling better now. I can control my hunger better. Third point is that it mitigates an obesogenic environment. For most people around the world, they live in an environment which encourages obesity. So if you're in the UK, the US, possibly Canada, some parts of Europe, you're living in a country which it's very easy to be fat in. Like I remember years ago when I came back from South Korea, when I was traveling out there, I came back really, really lean and really light, and I wasn't consciously trying to diet. It's just that life out there is not conducive to being fat. So we live in an obesogenic environment. So we have all these wonderful choices of food, all this advertising, all day. By implementing some fasting, we can mitigate some of that across the course of the week. So it's useful for that. It's the complete abstaining of food, which is quite useful, really. Next thing is it's time saving. Like I'm doing some fasting at the moment. It frees up a good maybe hour or so during the course of the day when I'm either eating or making food. And that hour is quite useful. I can go out and have more time to go for a walk, stretch my legs during the course of the day. I can finish early. It gives me time back. So it's not a bad thing, which saves you. Conversely, on the other end, it means you can possibly eat and relax more than likely when some or more of your family or loved ones are around in the evening, potentially. So a lot of people don't really like to have large, elaborate meals when they're at work, sat with work colleagues. They'd rather eat nice food and break bread with people who they love when they're at home. So it has that effect as well. Now, next thing from a health point of view, I regularly track my resting heart rate and my blood pressure. I've noticed that resting heart rate and blood pressure starts to trend downwards the more I fast, particularly if I'm fasting, say, on a consistent basis. So if I'm doing regular 24-hour fasts, or I have a daily eating window, regularly, I see resting heart rate and blood pressure go down. So that's potentially a nice idea for somebody who has poor control of heart rate or blood pressure, because we know that they're correlated fairly well with poor cardiovascular outcomes in the end. So that's something to bear in mind. I've also seen some research which suggests that regardless of weight loss, you'll see benefits from blood pressure just by fasting. So just the very act of fasting, even if you don't lose any weight, which means you're not in a calorie deficit, is still going to improve your blood pressure and your health outcomes. That's pretty cool, So you don't need to be in a calorie deficit, but just fasting and eating in a shorter eating window. Let's say you just can't handle dropping any more weight, or you just can't stomach, the diet, then fine. Even if you just do a bit of fasting and eat it up in your shortened window time, research has shown some positive benefits. Next thing is sleep. A lot of people don't sleep very well if they eat a lot of food directly before bed. So in like a bedtime snack, literally snacking in bed tends to be the worst for it, because you're going to sleep and your heart rate and your blood pressure is slightly elevated because you are pouring energy into your digestive system to try and digest the food which you've just eaten. It doesn't make for very good sleep. Your breathing is ragged and it's just not great. The older you get, the more you'll feel that. Like, for the best sleep, I personally find I stop eating about 2 hours before bed. That tends to be the best thing for me. So putting that into play usually improves sleep. Now, on the other end, I have known people to fast all day and just eat before bed, and they still get that benefit. So I think it's really just a case of maybe just not eating all day is probably a good thing. Sounds obvious, but there you go. Next thing is increased alertness during the course of the day. I mean, this all sounds fantastic so far, doesn't it? You know, it's not all roses, but there are some good benefits. Increased alertness during the course of the day. I personally find this. I think the opposite is eating during the course of the day. I mean, think about it. When do you feel most relaxed? You feel most relaxed after you've had a meal. So it's sort of counter to the point that people make sometimes, which is I want to eat more in the daytime because I'm going to use the fuel. It's not how it works at all. That's not how it works. During the course of the day, when you eat food, you have to divert energy to actually digest that food. And if you're running around working, using a lot of mental capacity with your job, probably not the best idea. Right? It's probably, on balance, better to divert the food when you're more able to relax and it's not as necessary for you to move around. So it's somewhat counter to commonly held wisdom that you should eat when you're active. I just don't think that's necessarily that true. I think if you don't have to pour energy into your digestive system, you're probably going to be more alert because eating just tires you out sometimes. Excuse me. Eating tires you out sometimes. Now, cough. So next thing is blood work. Now, I've noticed when periods of time that I've done a lot of fasting, it generally seems to coincide with excellent blood work. Cholesterol looks fantastic. Everything else looks great. So health-wise, going back to what I was saying about blood pressure, it's definitely quite positive. So I think that's something for people to bear in mind. If they are in a situation where their blood work is compromised, perhaps they've been obese for a long time, perhaps they have bad habits, perhaps there's a lot of alcohol involved, perhaps there's drugs involved, perhaps they're enhanced and, they want to clean things up. Well, fasting is a potential benefit there. It's something which might fast track that. So it's something to bear in mind. Now, second to last one is my experience with fasting on muscle gain and also maintaining muscle. Now, assuming protein is equalized, it doesn't tend to be a problem. Now, I mean, I'll talk about where the problem comes into, but assuming you're eating enough protein during the course of the day. So let's say you're doing a 16-8. Well, it's quite easy to get your protein in. If you're doing a 1 meal a day approach, well, it's a little bit harder. It's possible, but it's a little bit harder. But in general, as long as you get your protein in, you're going to be okay. And there is no limit to the amount of protein you can eat. Your body will just adjust. Now, the other advantage of fasting, which I can think of, these are all my personal benefits that I see. The final thing is it doesn't require the elimination of entire macro groups like carbs. Now, a lot of people will do keto and fasting, but there's also a lot of people who will do either keto or fasting because there are pros and cons of each. Now, what a lot of people don't like about keto is they don't like the fact they just can't eat any carbs. There's an adjustment period with keto, like the initial 4 to 6 weeks. You're still adjusting and you might find your gym performance compromised because you just don't have the energy to perform explosive work when you're in ketosis. Now, supposedly that does improve. I can say that I went on a keto diet for about 5 weeks and I still didn't see it. I was still gassing out in the gym and really hitting a wall, and it was very frustrating. Added some carbs back in and immediate benefits. So if I do keto, I tend to do more of a targeted approach, or at least a cyclical approach. I think with fasting, you don't have to eliminate food groups. You can have your carbs. It's just that the eating window tends to do a lot of the work. So that's some of the benefits. Certainly the ones that I've seen. I think there probably will be others. You guys in the comments will no doubt add your own. Now, in terms of the downsides, I think the biggest downside I've seen over the years, now both as a proponent of fasting, but also as a coach, is that it doesn't inherently teach the user good dietary habits. So like a keto diet, for example, the way it's written is specified, you've got a certain number of carbs, you've got a certain amount of fat, you've got a certain amount of protein. The problem with fasting is it doesn't actually tell you much about how to eat during the portion of time you're not fasting. Now, from what I've seen with a certain group of people, certain portion of people, the poor habits that they come into fasting with tend to get worse. So if somebody's just used to eating like KFC and crap all day, well, they're probably just going to do that in their eating windows as well. And what tends to happen is people will, over the long term, people will compensate by fasting for longer and longer. I once came across a guy on Reddit who said he was combining alternate day fasting with OMAD. Just think about that for a second. So basically, he was having about 3 to 4 meals per week. Just think about that. And he said on his thread he was on, he said he was maintaining his weight. Now you think to yourself, what would a guy have to eat to maintain his weight on 3 meals a week? No, I don't mean 3 meals a day per week. I mean 3 meals a week or 4 meals a week. What must those meals look like? Like they must be all highly calorific affairs. So this is my point with the downside is if somebody isn't actually making an effort to readdress their eating habits, they're going to have a bad time because over time they're just going to compensate more and more and more by fasting more and more to try and make this work. What they would be better off served doing is eating better, eating more whole foods, more unprocessed foods, and keeping with a sensible eating window. Now, the next thing is somewhat connected to that, is it can make people very, very lazy. Their NEAT can drop. So their level of activity, spontaneous activity, like I'm waving my hands around a lot, their level of spontaneous activity can drop a lot. Now, that was probably contributing to this guy I mentioned who was eating 3 or 4 meals a week. Most of the time, he was probably a slug. He was probably just one foot in the grave, not eating much, and or not eating anything, and just having really low energy. And then when he does eat, he just binges, which makes him even more tired. So the downside of fasting, and the first 2 points are connected, is if you don't simultaneously change or address what you're eating when you do eat, you're going to run into a problem where over the long term, to make that approach work, you're going to have to fast for longer and longer amounts of time to actually see fat loss or weight maintenance. And also, the longer you fast, the more your NEAT is going to drop. Fasting works best when it's done on an ad hoc basis. So this is why I like Brad Pilon's Eat Stop Eat. It's done on an abnormal sort of basis. It's not like every single day. I just don't think that's a great strategy. So that's the first 2 points. Third point is muscle loss can be a concern. It's a concern, you know. And finally, I'd say muscle gain is probably less than optimal. Now, with regards to the muscle loss, I mean, on some of the longer fasts, we can't really say we're not going to lose muscle. Like if you're going on a 48-hour fast and you train, so you break down muscle tissue, you'd have to present a very convincing argument to make me believe that you're not going to actually lose some muscle there. I don't see it. Like if you're not supplying your body with protein, how is it going to repair the muscle breakdown, which is quite devastating sometimes? It's not going to be able to do that. So I'm not convinced. I think daily fasting is probably okay for muscle loss, you know, and there are studies which look at high-level athletes and putting them on an eating window. Where I have a problem with is long-term fasts and also muscle gain. I think muscle gain is possible, definitely possible, but I think it's also probably less than optimal. I think it's probably more optimal to have evenly spaced protein throughout the day. However, the benefits that you receive from fasting may well outdo those negatives. So anyway, I'm going to call it there. It's quite a long video already, and I'm going to follow this up tomorrow with to begin looking at the different approaches that I've used, like 16-8, OMAD, 48-hour fasts, alternate day fasting, and various other ones, and just talk you through the pros and cons and how you might implement those. But hopefully that introduction to some of the benefits, some of the downsides, have provided food for thought, because I think it's a topic that a lot of people have interest in. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. All the best from me. Take care.